Who controls us? Consciousness or our unconscious? It would seem a strange question. If man were a slave of the unconscious, the world would rule chaos. However, everything is so far controversial. Today, many scientists believe that in fact, conscious thinking and decision-making occurs after the choice is made on an unconscious level. In other words, the brain makes a decision for us. We just fulfill its desires, and this is not an allegation. Behind him are scientific experiments. For the first time they were held in the late 80s. American scientist Benjamin Libet. He placed the electrodes on the head of the subject and asked to arbitrarily squeeze his hand. It seems to be an ordinary experience, but the encephalogram struck the scientist approximately half a second before the action in the brain appeared a signal. But this is not enough. The subjects themselves claim to have realized their decision a quarter of a second before the action. That is, the brain decided before the person thought about it. Opponents pointed to obvious gaps in the conclusions of the scientist. For example, it is difficult for a person to catch a delay of a quarter of a second. In a word, there is a lot of subjective, and therefore the experiments did not look very convincing. But today a technique has appeared at the disposal of science, which makes it possible to carry out experiments much more accurately. For example, the works of John Dylan Heines are known. He conducted studies on a magnetic resonance tomograph. The subject was asked to decide whether to add or subtract two numbers. Heines claims that the brain made the decision much earlier, 4 seconds before the person realized this. Time is huge. And the scientist concluded, our decisions are predetermined by the unconscious long before our consciousness recognizes them. The brain decides everything before the person himself. This statement of Heines caused an avalanche of comments and many in support of his version. Supporters say that we are biochemical puppets, that a person does not have his will, he is ruled by the unconscious. To object that we are making plans every day, trying to follow them, we should object, maybe it's the brain that writes us plans, and we are engaged in self-deception, they say. They themselves painted everything. Experiments Heines cause a lot of questions. For example, it is obvious that the brain is activated already when raising the task to raise a hand or perform a mathematical action, then makes a choice option. But how can you separate the addition from subtraction? And if a person hesitated in his decision, should this not affect the activation of the brain? But then the question arises, what and who ordered whom in the end? In a word, for categorical conclusions, much more thoughtful experiments are needed. Most of the actions we do unconsciously, on the machine. For example, when riding a bicycle, we do not track every movement. But when we master a ride, we rely mainly on consciousness. It learns new skills for itself and then, having mastered, sheds this science in the automaton, and consciousness simply looks after behavior, but does not ponder it. Otherwise, our consciousness simply could not cope with the huge number of tasks that arise before it every minute. In a word, nature has wisely distributed the memory matrix of stereotyped, experienced situations does manage our actions, but nobody will ever come to say that it controls a person.